This is wonderful. I'm watching our numbers grow as people join us from all over the world. My name is Sheila Heen. I am responsible for negotiation teaching here at Harvard Law School, and I am absolutely delighted to say good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of you who are joining us for the second in our Fisher Speakers series. We are incredibly lucky to have you joining us, and please feel free to drop a note into the chat telling us where you are tuning in from and saying hello to the community that's gathered here together. We're going to talk about Dr. Kofi Annan. Dr. Annan was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, the Indira Gandhi Prize, the Profile in Courage Award, among others, and during his tenure as the Secretary General of the United Nations from 1997 to 2006, Kofi Annan faced several critical global challenges that we can learn from. So during this second episode, we're going to explore Annan's travels in Africa, the Middle East, Central Europe, and other areas as he worked to bring peace in complex conflict situations. We are incredibly lucky to be joined today by a number of experts who can help us explore this. The first of which is, of course, Dr. Lamin Sise, Annan's longtime senior advisor and confidant. We're going to, with Dr. Sise, retrace the steps and revisit the thoughts and actions of Dr. Annan as he challenged African leaders and engaged conflicts and traveled through 100 countries. We're going to examine his work in Syria, in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Afghanistan, in the Congo, etc. Let me talk to you a little bit about Dr. Sise, who we are incredibly lucky to have with us. Dr. Sise worked with the United Nations for 30 years as a lawyer and then as a senior advisor to Mr. Annan, as his close collaborator and confidant, including mediating and negotiating with authorities at the highest levels. Dr. Sise also served as the chairman of the Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission of the Gambia in 2018 to 2021, to get my years right. Alongside Dr. Sise, we have Dr. Baba Jallow, who is our inaugural Roger Fisher Fellow in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Harvard Law School this year and has taught us so much over the course of this year already. Prior to his appointment and joining us in Cambridge, Dr. Jallow was the executive secretary of the Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission of the Gambia. His expertise includes colonial and post-colonial African history, transitional justice, and negotiation and conflict resolution. Speaking of transitional justice, our moderator today is my friend and colleague, Lisa Dicker. Lisa is a clinical instructor and my fellow faculty member at Harvard Law School. A Harvard Law School graduate, she served as counsel at a global pro bono law firm where she advised peace negotiations, conflict prevention, transitional justice, and post-conflict democratic transitions. She did that in the Sudan, in Syria, in Tanzania, in Yemen, and so she is incredibly well-placed to help lead this conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lisa Dicker.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sheila. And I'm so excited to be able to moderate this conversation today and be able to learn from our incredible speakers that we have. I wanted to begin our session with kind of setting some context for us, because anytime that we're looking back on someone's legacy and experience in conflict resolution, it's also through the lens of the fact that that tragedies and deep harms have happened in order to bring us to the point that we need this type of negotiation and need this type of conflict resolution. Both of our speakers today are from the Gambia. As you just heard from Sheila, we have the Executive Secretary of the Gambia's Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations Commission, and also the chairperson of the TRRC as well. And today's date, April 10th, holds significance in the Gambia because of harms that were suffered. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to Baba to lead us in a brief reflection on what April 10th means in the Gambia.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thanks, Sheila, for that kind introduction. April 10 is a very sad day, in the history of the Gambia and Gambian transitional justice. 10 and 11, 2000, some students, the Gambia Students Union organized a peaceful demonstration to ask the government to investigate and bring to justice two cases of human rights violations in the Gambia on students. One case was the case of beaten to death by fire officers, fire service officers, firefighters in the town of Birkama. And the second case was the case of two paramilitary officers who raped a young girl at a stadium, at a sports event. And the government was dragging its feet over the investigations, and the students decided to come out and peacefully demonstrate on April 10. And the government reaction was to send out security forces, heavily armed security forces, and order them to open fire. They opened fire on the crowds of demonstrators, student demonstrators, and killed over a dozen students and one young radio journalist who was also serving as a Red Cross volunteer at the time. So during the TRRC, we held a session, a 3-week session on the April 10 and 11 tragedy. So, today coincide the day, and Lisa, with your permission, I would just ask that we all observe a moment of silence in honor and memory of the victims of April 10, 11, and also say a prayer for them. Then we hand over to you.
Thank you. Let's all take a moment. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Lisa, just one connection with Kofi Annan and this date of April 10th, year 2000. I was with Annan in Havana, Cuba. We were attending the summit of the non-aligned movement, or the G77 summit. And Jame was in the audience, the heads of state sitting, and he had a black telephone. He was the only one with a black telephone sitting on his desk, a table in front of him in the conference hall. And Kofi then leaned to me and said, Lamin, I think your friend, he just would say your friend is monitoring the developments in the Gambia. We had been briefed before the summit meeting started that day, the plenary session, by the Department of Political Affairs on developments in the Gambia. But there was that thing out there. We saw him in Jame in Havana handling the developments in the Gambia.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story, and also being able to highlight how these moments in time intersect with each other, and the work that you were doing at the UN level with the Secretary General also is related to then work that you did post-UN as well, returning to the Gambia and the Truth Commission. Thank you. So I'm excited to dive into our discussion and continue this conversation. As we look at the legacy and the journey in peacekeeping and peacemaking of Kofi Annan, we're going to do so, of course, through the lens of negotiation and conflict resolution. And so I will bring you to the beginning, Lamin, of your work with the Secretary General to start. I would love for you to tell us a bit about how you became the senior advisor to Secretary General Annan, and the challenges and conflicts that were in your collective portfolio when you began this position and started that journey with him.
I had known Annan before we started working together. My background is law, and I started my UN career with UNCTAD, the Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva, as deputy legal advisor. Our paths came across briefly. Annan came from headquarters in New York to the High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. He was working there briefly. We met later. But it was when I came back from Geneva and 2 years in Amsterdam that I moved from the legal service after 14 years of doing legal work the political side. And Annan was then Under Secretary General for the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And I joined his cabinet in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And that's how we started working together on peacekeeping matters. Almost everything that the UN was involved in, peacekeeping, was handled in the department. And Rwanda came up, Bosnia was on. And at some point, I was sent out to the mission in Bosnia, went to Sarajevo, a few months there. Now, during that time, Annan was the Brutozali, the Secretary General at that time, sent him to Zagreb, Croatia, to be his special representative there. So we overlapped in Bosnia at some point as well, but the work was essentially the department at headquarters here in New York.
Excellent. As you began working with Annan, how did he approach conflicts and challenges that you saw him engaging in, such as Bosnia and Rwanda?
He was a very engaging fellow who really liked to bring together, very inclusive, liked to bring together all the stakeholders involved in any conflict thing. The team that he is put together at headquarters, the team that is out in the field, the coordination of these teams, and then the policymakers in the Security Council. He found a way of putting together these entities to pursue the mandate that would have been given by the Security Council in any particular peacekeeping mission.
Absolutely. And as Kofi Annan became the Secretary General, situating ourselves in time, what were some of the kind of focus areas or key conflicts that were most at his attention when he first stepped into the role as Secretary General?
Well, you had intervention in long-standing conflicts that preceded him. But those ones continued. So Cyprus, for instance, Democratic Republic of Congo, Middle East, those ones are there. And there were new ones coming up as well. And also the emergence of non-state actors in certain conflicts. All those things came up as we went on. And of course, the Rwanda genocide, peacekeeping mission that was deployed in Rwanda just before the genocide. The other peacekeeping missions in Africa, or he also would get involved in conflicts between countries in Nigeria and Cameroon, for example, on Bakassi Peninsula, Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, again, territorial dispute. The conflicts in DRC, before that, Zaire, got into all that, and of course conflicts in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and he was engaged in all these conflicts.
Thank you. And I wonder, as we think about negotiation and conflict resolution, what was Secretary General Annan's philosophy of negotiation, and how did that show up in his work in these very varied contexts?
Very much preventive intervention. He believed very much in that, having a sustained and dedicated diplomacy, pursuing certain things. Again, examples that I can give, Bakassi was a good one. Nigeria and Cameroon had a dispute on that territory, perhaps oil-rich a small peninsula on the Gulf of Guinea area. And the two countries could have gone to war, but he saw this and wanted to engage the heads of state, President of Obasanjo of Nigeria and the President Paul Biya of Cameroon, that find a way of solving this dispute so it doesn't escalate to armed conflict between the two countries because of the potential of oil deposits in the area. It could be a flashpoint and a dispute on it. So what he did was when in '94, I think it was, Cameroon took the case, the dispute to the International Court of Justice, and then engaged the two presidents and also the ICJ. What he did was to make sure, fine, he respected the jurisdiction of the ICJ, a court dealing with an issue. You don't intervene. But what he did was he sent me privately to The Hague to go meet with the president of the International Court of Justice, not to interfere with what the decision would be. What he wanted, the president of the ICJ, who was then the French judge, Gilbert Guillaume, he wanted Gilbert to know that he is involved in some behind-the-scenes negotiation with the two leaders, and that he wanted to commit them to accepting the decision, whichever way it went when it came. And but he would want the ICJ to alert him. So that was a contact with the president of the ICJ to alert him when the court would come up with the decision, and he would then do his logistics work with the two presidents and then get them to accept the decision, whichever way, as I said, it went. And that was what I did. I went and had meetings, 2 days of meetings with Gilbert Guillaume, George Guillaume, in The Hague, and he agreed to do that. And just before, 2 weeks before the decision was announced, he called the SG and the Secretary General, and then continued his contacts with President Obasanjo and President Biya, and they both assured him that they would accept the decision of the ICJ. That prevented something that would have been a catastrophe in West Africa. Can you imagine Nigeria going to war with Cameroon and that region, and the consequences of that in the sub-region would have been catastrophic.
So thank you so much for that example of his preventative intervention philosophy in practice. I think something that's always interesting to me sitting at a law school is how differently courts function in an international space. When a decision comes out, most of the enforcement has to be done through negotiation and persuasion. And it sounds like Annan was able to do that very effectively in this moment in order to gain buy-in to whatever decision was made and be able to negotiate the implementation of that decision then as well.
He did a similar thing, again, with the International Court of Justice concerning another territorial dispute that's between Qatar and Bahrain. That was also before the International Court of Justice. Again, he sent me there. I quietly went, flew to The Hague, and then met with Guillaume. I think Guillaume was still president of the ICJ. And the same thing happened. And he called the leaders of Qatar, the Emir, and the Emir of Bahrain as well, and committed them to accepting the decision of the ICJ. So again, another dispute was a potential dispute, I think conflict was averted with that kind of preventive intervention, as he called it.
Excellent. And I wonder with preventative intervention, how did yourself and Secretary General Annan know when the moment was ripe to step in for preventative intervention versus it being general tensions between a country? How did the analysis go to say, all right, it is now time to begin these preventative interventions for negotiation to de-escalate or resolve a potential conflict that hasn't necessarily erupted in an armed way yet, versus, oh, this is general dispute that is happening?
Well, he stayed engaged. That's the thing out there. He was aware of what was going on, but stayed engaged with the parties. And as I said, he was very inclusive, would bring in, but again, another dispute perhaps in the Africa area was the Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. Again, oil resources at the heart of this whole thing. He had meetings. Anytime I went with him to the OAU, AU summit meetings, we would have mini summits on the side. And meetings, we would, among those mini summits was meeting with the two presidents. At that time, Gabon president was Bongo, and then and the Equatorial Guinea, Aubin. He would have a conference, a mini conference, mini summit with these two leaders, and also send envoys there. So it's staying engaged. That was the trick. Staying engaged with it. Cyprus, the same thing. Give you another example of where you have something going on. Because he was engaged, something, there is a problem that likely would spark would start violence in the area. He would he called in the leaders of Cyprus, the two communities. Papadopoulos was the president, and Rauf Denktash was the leader of the Turkish Cypriot community. He called them these individuals for a summit in The Hague, and the two leaders came in there, talked about the issue that was that was really causing problem between the two communities. And at some point, again, being inclusive in that, we, during that meeting, that meeting in The Hague, we got stuck at some point with the Denktash delegation not agreeing on how we proceed on a particular issue. And I'm going to tell you those details. But what had happened, he, again, contacting some key players, the thing, he then suspended the meeting. Mr. Annan suspended the meeting briefly, went in the office next door, and placed a call to then Prime Minister-elect at that time, Edouard. And Edouard had been elected Prime Minister, had not taken office then. This was before the presidency was introduced in Turkey, Turkey. He was contacted by the Secretary General, and when he told him what the issue was, then he came back, and within a few minutes, somebody came in, got Rauf Denktash out and said, Edwan, the Prime Minister-elect of Turkey wants to talk to you. So he went out there, 20 minutes, he was in that room, and when he came back, the matter was resolved. Again, the Secretary General's intervention with the then Prime Minister-elect, that solved the problem. So there's this engagement, staying with people, contacts that he needs to make with the right people here and there, that really helped him achieve results in some areas here and there. Well, sometimes they don't. They're very difficult here and there, what you get.
Absolutely. And I wonder, knowing Secretary General's approach to peacemaking, how did the nature of conflicts change over the course of his tenure and your work with him? And how did his philosophy to engagement adapt or remain the same during the change in the nature of conflicts?
Well, as I said, with non-state actors getting involved in conflicts here and there, that complicated matters. There were times when some states that are involved in it would not want to deal with non-state actors. And they find it difficult to see what. An example was when Hamas and Quartet meetings that were going on in the Middle East, in Gaza and West Bank and Israel, and the Quartet group. There were members of that group that weren't comfortable dealing with Hamas and a non-state entity as such. But there were moments also you have to find a way of dealing with somebody that you're struggling, you're having problems somehow with. You can't just ignore them, and then but so those are that's an example of a non-state entity getting involved in that complicated sometimes some of the things that he was dealing with.
Yeah, and so it sounds like as the nature of conflicts and the actors involved with them shifted during his tenure, his philosophy remained similar, but it was more of a matter of being able to get other parties, such as state actors, also bought into an inclusive approach to the process. You have to talk to the parties that are involved, that are stakeholders in it. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, it is.
And what would you say over the course of your work was the biggest obstacle to success or successful negotiations, at least?
The political will, the absence of political will in dealing with certain issues. It's always an obstacle. Always coming in, they would get in there, and sometimes the thing just doesn't. The political will is not there to move. I'll give you another example about when he left office in 2007. At some point, 2012, his successor, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, asked him with the Arab League to see if he could be a special envoy for Syria, to help them on Syria. They weren't getting anywhere. The conflict was escalating. The civil war was really getting very, very, very bad in Syria. So he was invited to join, to become a special representative, a special envoy of the UN and the Arab League to see if he can bring peace to Syria. He agreed to do that, established his office in Geneva. I had just finished working with him on Kenya, and returned to what I thought was going to be a quiet moment for me in the US summer here. He called and said, no, let's get to Geneva. Been given this dossier, but before that, we meet in New York and go to the Security Council. You see, at that time, the confidence, the trust that they had in him, and the hope that maybe he would find a way of bringing peace to Syria. Of course, he then went and convened a meeting at some point. I'm jumping quickly, fast forward, to a meeting that he had of the Friends of Syria. This is the P5 plus 4 other countries in an all-day meeting. This is at the foreign minister level, all-day meeting in Geneva to get. So he knew the people, the entities to bring in that negotiation, and the U.S. Secretary of State at that time was Hillary Clinton. Sergei Lavrov was, and still is, a Russian foreign minister. They were all there for that day, and Laurent Fabius for France. And what had happened on that 30 June 2012 meeting was to get an agreed, a joint communique that really had a very good roadmap for peace in Syria. But then what happened was these were 9 countries, P5 plus 4, meeting in Geneva, and good work done. They worked very closely with him. He was trusted, and they believed in what he was proposing to them. And when they got the agreement, because they were not the Security Council, it was a group that needed them to take whatever they concluded to the Security Council, and they did that. The communique was sent, but when they came to Geneva, to New York, the politics, the goodwill was absent, and the whole thing fell apart. Finger pointing, name calling among the member states, and that he had seen all that this United Security Council was not getting anywhere. He ended up, unfortunately, resigning 6 months after he was named that, and we saw what continued. I think if he had perhaps been successful in making these guys, making the key players not start attacking each other here in New York, then perhaps we would have had peace in Syria, and the hundreds and the thousands of people who were killed, that perhaps would have been avoided.
Yeah, and it's, I think, very interesting in this example as well of oftentimes political will, folks focus in on the political will of the parties that are sitting at the negotiation table that will eventually sign or hopefully sign an agreement with each other. However, in this example, it was also the political will of the various third-party countries as well, who were key actors in the Security Council, who had votes or didn't have votes in order to move the communique forward. That was also a key issue in those beginning stages of the UN-led peace process for Syria too. So I hear a lesson of not just look at the political will of the parties sitting at the table, but also look at the political will of the actors behind the table that are going to be necessary to push the parties towards peace.
Indeed, that is absolutely correct. Yes, the political will of all players really is that it is an obstacle. The absence of that is an obstacle to solving many problems that he had been involved in throughout his secretary generalship.
And based on your experience, what would you say are key skills that are necessary in peacemaking and then keeping peace after it is achieved?
I think, as I said, staying engaged. He had a personality that was conducive, that was good for the kind of negotiations, and that what he was not somebody whose style is threatening. He was a very humble fellow in a very positive way and dignified way. The way he talked to people, the trust that he had received, the people reposed in him, all that was very, very helpful and gave him some success in it. As I said, yes, there were difficulties here and there. There were times when he didn't. Iraq was an example. The time that the 2003 intervention in Iraq, when he cautioned against that, talked to the key players at that time who wanted to go, President Bush, George Bush, and Prime Minister Tony Blair, talking to them about, but he did not succeed in telling those people not to intervene in Iraq in 2003.
Thank you. Well, I'll pose one more question to you, Lamin, before I turn to some of the questions that have been coming in the Q&A function on Zoom. So for those that are sitting on questions on your mind, feel free to pop into the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen and pop in those questions, and I'll pose as many as I can during the remaining time. But the last question that's coming from me, looking back on your time with Secretary General Annan, what would you say is his greatest legacy?
It's in bringing the organization closer to the people, putting emphasis on human rights, that human rights should be the center of what the organization did. What he proposed also in 2000, the first time it started in a speech in 1999, and then at some point later on, 6 years later, it took that much time for the General Assembly to endorse his proposal on responsibility to protect the civilians, essentially, in countries where they are at the risk of catastrophe. So responsibility to protect human rights and the rule of law, bringing the people, putting people at the center of what the organization did, bringing the organization also closer, or having relationship with entities that were crucial, the private sector, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations. All this, he opened up the thing and the relationship that's there. So the private sector, the pharmaceutical the sector, industry, helped them. He worked closely with them when they were dealing with the HIV, AIDS issue, bring them in. So it's that inclusivity that I think his legacy would be, and also his style of dealing with these handling these conflicts. And I said the trust that the leaders had in him, they would call him. I mean, why call him after retirement to come and help with Syria? And as I said, if you see the joint communique that was issued on the 30th of June 2012, that he came up with a balanced roadmap, a reasonable, a good roadmap for peace in Syria. All these things were really a product of what he did and who he was as well. But he had the right personality, was not threatening to anybody, and they sought his advice and counsel from time to time, privately and publicly, to come and help him in finding this thing that they're promoting the ideals and the principles that organization was established for.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think building on the skill sets that are needed for peacekeeping and peacemaking, and also Annan's greatest legacy. The first question that I'll take from the Q&A that the participants have submitted relates to that role. And so I wonder, based on this question, what yourself and Secretary General Annan viewed as the mission of a mediator or good offices during periods of conflict?
Well, first, a thorough understanding of what they are mediating the conflict, knowing the key players in those things, and again, staying engaged with the stakeholders. That is a sine qua non for success in any of these engagements.
Excellent. And I wonder, I think that this builds also off of Annan's approach that was a very inclusive approach to negotiations. What do you do with actors who may be negotiating in bad faith? Do they stay part of that inclusive process? Should they be isolated from it? How do you engage with actors that may be negotiating in bad faith?
Well, so first you define their role and then see what it is they are really acting in bad faith on. What are the issues, and then find a way of solving that problem. Yes, indeed, there are people, there are interlocutors that may not be acting in good faith at all, and then you find a way of how he had a way of as I said, getting to know what the issues were, and then try to get around those games that perhaps some of those actors, I'm sorry to use that, but games that some actors will be playing.
Excellent. So being able to find those pressure points, find ways to engage them, not isolate, but bring them into acting in at least better faith. Productive.
If that would solve the problem, and sometimes it does solve the problem, and it works. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I've had a few questions come into the chat that relate to how Kofi Annan's perspective on peacemaking would apply to current contexts. If Kofi Annan was working on some of the ongoing conflicts or instability in places like Gaza, Ukraine, or Haiti presently, how do you think his approach to those regions would be, and how do you think it would translate?
I suspect that the trust that they had in him, he would be very much involved in trying to find a way out. Yes, cannot be able to prevent what's going on in Gaza, but he would, I suspect, the leaders that he knows in the area would continue to play the role of getting everybody involved and looking at the bigger picture in bringing peace and stability and security in the Middle East.
Excellent. And also a present context that a question has come in on is that the Indian Supreme Court has recommended that Kashmir undergo a truth and reconciliation process, so bridging your work with the UN to your work in the Gambia. However, there seems to be no political will or moral courage to move forward with truth and reconciliation. From your perspective, does that process need more time to develop political will organically, or pressure in order to have the political will? Essentially, when political will is lacking, what do you do?
Well, you insist, you persist. You persist, and then see what you can do. But yes, establishing a truth and reconciliation process, you would need a political will, a decision that yes, this is what we need. We had gone through a traumatic experience. We need to reflect on this. How do we avoid this thing happening again in our society? It is again, that political will that would have to be there. If it is not there, the mediator perhaps would persist. Just keep on trying until they do it. But for TRCs, I mean, the truth, the transitional justice mechanisms, I mean, the political will just would have to be around. They would have to want to have it for that to go on.
Yeah, so it sounds like those types of processes can't be forced upon a country or a region as well. There has to actually be the political will within it to participate effectively.
And the mediator's role in some of these things is also very important. And give again another example of the impact of what was going to happen in the Balkans, the Kosovo situation, the indictment of Milosevic that he was involved in. The Secretary General was again privately informed what was developing in the Kosovo situation and the indictment of Milosevic that was coming. The prosecutor of the international, the criminal court for former Yugoslavia, ICTY, needed there was a sealed indictment for to get Milosevic indicted, but they had to handle it in such a way that there was a bit of concern that the UN personnel and other states personnel in Belgrade perhaps would be taken hostage once their president has been indicted. So the prosecutor had to deal with the Secretary General quietly to find a way from saying, look, this is going to happen within the next few days. The sealed indictment is going to be made public, and you need to move your staff away, personnel, the key personnel, from this area, so they would not be at risk. That cooperation there, even where he knew that the indictment would trigger something, but a process that he just could not stop.
And a question that has also come in is, do you think there are any drawbacks to or shortcomings to Secretary General Annan's approach to negotiations?
I don't think so. I don't think of drawback. Yes, you have setbacks occasionally here and there. You have difficulties that crop up, but if the commitment is there to pursue a particular endeavor concerning conflict or potential conflict, that commitment should just be pursued.
Excellent. And so critiques potentially that the Secretary General lacked assertiveness, for instance, you believe are unwarranted?
I don't think so. Almost exactly 70 years ago, 1954, one of Annan's predecessors, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, said that the United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save humanity from going to hell. That was it. So the limitations are there in the Charter. Yes, indeed, this is an organization of states, and with all the limitations here and there, but there is no alternative to it. The way that I just asked the Nobel Peace Committee in 2001, when they awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2001 to the United Nations and to Secretary General Kofi Annan, they said it very clearly. There is no way to any of these things without going through the organization. If you close it down today, you're going to have to create a new entity that would handle relations between states and the things that the Charter talks about.
Absolutely. And I wonder, oftentimes in negotiations, Folks think that an approach that leaves emotions out of it, if we can just suppress the emotions, we would be able to get through the facts, get through the substance as well. However, I know that there's lauding of Secretary General Annan and his emotional intelligence in negotiations. Can you say a few pieces or name any examples about how his emotional intelligence showed up in the way that he engaged parties?
Well, that's how he engaged parties, and he as I said, his style was one of being calm and calmness, and also the trust that the parties reposed in him. I don't know how, when you say intelligence, dealing with it, there are interlocutors that come up with things that you don't know how they're going. Say, meetings with Fidel Castro, give you an example. Meetings with Gaddafi, where the engagement is a very different thing. We remember again when we went to Havana, Castro's style is very different from Annan. Castro, the UN head who was there, said to me, Lamin, you may have your plan A, the team that came here in Havana is and that and that. You probably have a plan B on certain issues. But let me tell you, Castro would come with a plan C that you're not aware of. The first thing that did, again, I don't know if this would address your question of intelligence, but is the interlocutor who that person is and what really happens. So Castro, the first place, Castro never will go to the airport to receive visitors, but he liked Annan very much. He came to the airport, was at the foot of the plane when we came down, and he told the press and told everybody that, he said, look, I don't come to the airport to receive visitors, but you, I like you, this and that and that and that. I think there was a prime minister or head of state who was also on that plane, and he turned to that, Castro turned to that person and said, I didn't come to meet you. I came to meet the Secretary General. Everybody laughed and we went on. But he then came to us and said, Annan, I understand at the plenary meeting of the summit is that you're going to speak for about 10 minutes. The world wants to hear you, and 10 minutes is not enough. Again, knowing Castro, how long he goes on and on and on and on. And he was trying to engage the SG to change his style, do this and that and that. And he, just as I was told, plan C, he changed the whole speaking arrangement. Our program was changed. So he was a co-chair of that meeting with President Obasanjo. And he then arranged the thing in such a way, 2 or 3 or 4 speakers came before him when he was supposed to be the second speaker, but he made himself the 3rd or the 4th speaker in order to then go on. So instead of the 10 minutes thing, he spoke for about an hour or so. He just went on and on and on. Now, again, an example of his engagement with the interlocutors. I don't know what do you think, if that answers your question to a certain extent about his approach to things and emotional thing about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that it's such a wonderful example of in heading into negotiations with a particular actor, you don't just need to know the substance and have your own plan on the issues, but you also need to know the personalities involved and the particular style of negotiation that they may be bringing as well.
And you have to keep your cool as well.
Mm-hmm.
Again, since we're dealing with him and the thing of it, he was a very calm fellow. Doesn't lose his temper. This and that happen. If some may find it a bit deceptive and think that they can pull a fast one on him here and there. We had he's concerned about refugees. What was going on? The Kosovo war was going on, was raging. We had gone for a visit in the area and meeting with the leaders in Macedonia and Albania and went on. So when we were in Macedonia and Skopje, the issue of Kosovo refugees came up. And he was getting the feeling that these guys, some leaders here, seem to be thinking that the Kosovo refugees weren't refugees par excellence. They weren't refugees reality. He said they were saying, implying that these guys were economic migrants. And he wanted to put a stop to that because, as I said, he had worked with UNHCR. He knows some of the 1951 Convention and the status of refugees and the protection that they needed. He didn't want them to have that protection diluted. So how did this thing happen? When we finished the meeting, the preparation with the president of Macedonia, we then went to, he told us after the meeting that we need to put a stop to this thing of not regarding the Kosovo refugees as such. So we went to Tirana, Albania, the capital, and a meeting there. And we had a president and delegation, a long table, everybody, Secretary General's meeting, delegation on one side, the president on the other side. Now, at some point, when he was speaking, there was, I think, I don't remember what ministry he had, but a minister who wasn't too far from us, who were on our side of the table, but on the other side, the minister then started saying, but. Now, when he said, but, and the way he reacted, nobody, because he wasn't at the time, he just stopped. He said, don't interrupt me when I'm speaking. Something that doesn't happen that way. And the guy was quiet for a while, and then later on, the meeting continued, and at some point, the fellow, somebody said, can you speak a bit louder? We can't hear you. Annan spoke very softly. So the minister who was told, don't interrupt me, quickly said, no, that's what I was trying to tell you. Annan didn't believe him. He thought that the guy was because he was dealing with protection refugees at that very point when this guy intervened. He thought that that was what was going on. Later on, he never gave up on that. We got in the cars, we told him, no, he didn't hear you. So he would tell us, Lamin, you guys believe that this guy did not hear me. No, he wanted to talk about protection of refugees, and he was very well committed to that. Sorry, long story, but there's another example of his personality and how he dealt with interlocutors.
And I think such a wonderful example of how his calmness did not mean that he was passive or a pushover.
Or weak.
Or weak. Yes, exactly. The calmness was actually a large amount of control as well in negotiations. Dr. Lamin, Dr. Sise, I so appreciate you sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. And I wish that we had another 4 hours to talk and discuss all of the questions that are coming in and the knowledge that you could share with us. But unfortunately, we are almost at our hour. And so I will just voice my deep appreciation for yourself, Lamin, and pass the mic over to Sheila to let us know about some future events with the program on negotiations that we can all continue learning together.
Thank you very much, Lisa. My pleasure indeed to share these things about Annan with the Harvard Law School community. Thank you very much.
Well, and Dr. Sise, you have shared them with the world because we have had people joining us from 30 countries all over the world. I want to thank people for joining the conversation, for adding to it with your fantastic insights, comments, and questions. Lots of events coming up to put on your own calendars. coming up both in-person, intensive in-person experiences and virtual programs. So please do visit the PON website and think about the conversations that you would like to be part of next. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us.